Hello, everyone, and welcome to Adult Education. This is the Adult Education class for January 9th, 2022, and it is fully virtual. We are back in the saddle here. I'm still getting my sea legs for how to start these things off, but we are here, we are ready to go, and it's just a good time to be together in whatever way we can. We have a guest today, Ellen Barnard, who is from A Woman's Touch here in Madison, and she is here to talk to us about sex and being comfortable talking about sex. And I look forward to the conversation and the ways in which we can learn and grow together. Let us pray. Wonderful and gracious God, we give thanks for the way that you've created us, for the bodies we inhabit, for the ways that we can feel in those bodies, for the pleasure and joy and elation, for the sensuality and the senses that you give us. We ask that you open our hearts to those senses, you keep us aware of those good things that you have made in us, and that you help us to spread the good news that we are your children, blessed, made good in your image, and that what you have made is good. Remind us of that. Help us to remind others. Amen. All right, Ellen, I'm going to turn it over to you. You are now spotlighted, and I'm going to mute myself. So after you.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome. Really appreciate that Charlie invited me to do this. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. If you saw the newsletter, you saw my bio, so I'm not going to go into that. And I'm going to start with a story. And I tell this story because it really helps you understand why it is and how it is that I'm so comfortable talking about this. So I was a child of divorced parents, grew up in a home where my mother was very curious about everything, and I was an insatiable reader, and there were books everywhere, and I read everything. So wherever I found a book, I opened it up, I started reading it. One day, this very big book showed up on the coffee table, and it was called The Whole Earth Catalog. And it was actually a compilation of excerpts from all of the sort of cutting edge independent books that had come out the past year. And I opened the book up because I was, of course, an insatiable reader. Giant book, let's read. And I happened to open it up. I was 11 years old, and I happened to open it up to a photograph, an image of a naked woman. Now, at 11 years old, one is very curious about all these things. Certainly I was. So I started reading the piece that was around it, and I started reading a piece from the very first, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was a book written by a feminist health collective to try to help women demystify all aspects of their bodies. And the chapter that they happened to include was a chapter on masturbation for women. And it was filled with all the reasons it was good for you and then how to do it. And so I read everything because I read everything. And then I had to figure out how to try what they were telling me to do. And when I did that, I had the most amazing experience and the most amazing revelation about my own body. Something nobody had ever taught me, something I knew nothing about. And of course, at that point, I had to start teaching all my friends this amazing thing, because that's what you do when you're 11 years old. You share the amazing discoveries that you've made. And that's how I became a sex educator. And I never stopped talking about sex and sex as pleasure, which is how I discovered it, and sex on my own terms. So I was a pretty unusual kid, and I'm a pretty unusual adult in that I got to start in understanding my body and what it was capable of, and in understanding, for whatever reason, that I didn't need to be ashamed about it. That is not where most of us start. That is not where most of us live, in fact. And I spend most of my time now helping people try to understand that what their desires are not necessarily wrong or shameful, and to understand how to contextualize those so that they stay within a framework of healthy adult intimacy. So paying attention to all of that language, right? Healthy adult intimacy, keeping it in context, keeping things in a framework really helps us understand how we can approach talking about and thinking about sexuality with others and with ourselves, quite honestly. So what we're here to do today is to set things up for the rest of your series, right? You've got this lovely series that's been put together where you're going to explore all kinds of topics. You're going to explore sexuality. You're going to explore sexual identity and orientation. You're going to explore gender. A lot of things that we're talking about in the culture, certainly, and a lot of things that most of us have never learned anything about, have never gotten permission to think about or explore. Or if we have gotten permission, it has only been through finding that permission on our own. We didn't grow up in a culture that gave us that permission. So in order to really do this work, you have to start by exploring what you learned, what you think, what you feel, what you believe. Where are your limits in what you can comfortably interact around, and where are the places that shut you down or bring up judgment? So we're going to spend a little bit of time, and I'm going to ask, all right, so we need to end at 10:55. Is that correct? I believe that's right. So I'm going to try to keep my clock here, but I don't know if it'll work. All right. So thanks, Jeff. What we're going to start with, and I don't know if all of it, unfortunately, I don't think the instruction to print out my questions came through. So I'm going to just ask you questions, and I want you to take a piece of paper and a pen or pencil and just answer them, or type on a device or whatever it is that you're most comfortable doing. And this is mostly self-reflection. If somebody wants to answer, they can. I will give some examples of answers that I've gotten in the past after each reflection point. The first one, and this is really important. So I just told you my story, or part of my story of how I learned about sex and how I learned to frame it for myself. So now I want you to reflect on, where did you learn about sex? Where did you learn? Who did you learn it from? And what were you taught? Let's just take a moment to scratch a bit of notes there for yourself. This is the hardest part, right? I don't get to see you, so I don't see when people are done. All right, so I ask this question almost all the time when I do talks. And what I've learned is I get answers like, I didn't learn anything about sex. Or I learned in school about, if you're old enough, what you learned about maybe is reproduction, how the body works to make babies, not make babies. Sometimes your parents may have also shared that information. Some people learned that sex was only for making babies. Some people learned that sex was only to happen between people once they were fully committed in marriage. Many people tell me that they learned first from friends or from media or from culture, and what they learned was confusing and unclear. Or they learned from somebody somewhere that some aspect of sex is bad, or they learned about sex through sexual abuse, trauma, or assault. All of those things are the experiences that we bring to our initial development of learning. And that frames everything else that comes, right? Because then we have to figure out all kinds of things for ourselves if we didn't learn it. So now I ask the question, and this is the question that most people don't think about very often, but where did you learn about pleasure? And I'm talking about sexual pleasure at this point. From whom? And if you haven't learned about pleasure, that's valid as well, by the way. I still, every day I talk to people in my job and they tell me things like, I never really figured out pleasure. I never figured out how sex could work for me, or mostly it's uncomfortable or painful. That happens every day, and it's people of all ages. So if you didn't learn about pleasure, that's okay. Doesn't mean you can't. So pondering that, and that's something to just let sit. These are the things that I always want people to consider and to reflect upon, because for all of us, where we learned about sex, what judgments and frameworks and messages we got or didn't get from our families, from our churches, from our culture, from our friends, from the media, shape how we react in the future to everything, our own personal experiences and others. So the next question I have, and this is one of those questions that for some of you, you're going to be wondering, why do I even ask? And that's fine. But the question is, when did you first know, identify, feel inside of you your gender? Was it a conscious knowing, or was it just that you always felt like you aligned with what your family and community identified as your gender? And when I say gender, I mean male, female, whatever it was that you were assigned at birth. And if you didn't identify with what you were assigned at birth, when did you start noticing that maybe you felt out of alignment with what you had been told you were based on your anatomy and physiology? And what did you do with that? And I ask this because for most of us growing up, we don't actually even think about what our gender is. But for some of us, we do. And for some of us, when we realize that the internal feeling of who we are doesn't match what society, family, culture, what we were labeled when we were born, that can create a lot of dissonance and dysphoria. Dysphoria, you'll hear this later in one of your lectures, where somebody feels at odds internally, externally. And it's important to understand one of the tools we use when we want to talk to somebody whose experience is different from ours. I do not know what the thumbs up means, but I'm just going to go with that. That means we're doing okay. But when we want to be able to hear other people's experiences and hold space for them, we have to understand that their experiences might be different from ours. We have to understand that somebody else maybe not feeling in alignment with how they were labeled when they were born, how they have been labeled in our communities and in our cultures and their families. We have to feel some empathy, and we have to hold that feeling in us so that we can be open. And we'll talk about that some more as we go along. All right. So another thing that a lot of us weren't necessarily aware of, but I asked the question because many of us were, or many of us had experiences at odds with, again, the assumptions that were placed around us, is when did you first become aware of your sexual orientation? And when I ask that, I ask, when did you first understand that you were heterosexual, which means attracted to somebody who is of the opposite, if we're looking at the binary around genders, the opposite gender of yours? Or when did you start to become aware that maybe you were attracted to somebody who was the same sex, the same gender, or that you found yourself attracted to all kinds of people, not just the opposite or the same, but a multitude? For those of you who grew up and were in alignment with feeling what you were told you were supposed to be. So I grew up in a culture that said I was going to be attracted to men. I was going to marry a man. I was going to have babies. I was going to fulfill this, what is known in academia as the heteronormative path in terms of relationships and family. If I was somebody who didn't find that aligned within me, can you imagine how that might feel, especially if people don't validate that, right? So when our internal sense of self is at odds with the external expectations, that creates tension. That can create fear if you are aware that people will judge you, will shame you, or harm you for having those attractions, those interests, those having that identity that is at odds. So understanding if you never had that sense of being at odds, or if you did, what does it, when it happens, what it means. And opening yourself, if you had the smooth path that said, I have always aligned with the expectations that were put upon me and around me by my family, by my church, by my culture. And then shift your perspective to imagine what it would be like if that weren't true. So one of the exercises I sometimes do with groups is I say, let's flip it on its head, and say, imagine you lived in a culture where the only acceptable attractions were to people of your own sex. And you were not attracted to people of your own sex, you were attracted to somebody else. And you couldn't share that with people because that wasn't acceptable. You would be shamed, you would be judged, or you would be physically attacked if you shared it. Imagine what that would feel like. And hold that feeling. And understand that that may be the experience of some people that you encounter in the world. And just sit with, what does that feel like inside of you? You might be noticing that I keep asking you to feel this. I loved the prayer that Jeff started because it was rooted in the body. And all of our interactions have a physical component in our bodies. And our emotions are expressed as feelings in our bodies. Our experiences are felt in our bodies. It's not just all our minds. And the experience of being a human, in fact, is this mind-body meld that creates how we have our interactions. So when you have an experience with someone who's vastly different from yourself, or who you perceive as someone you don't understand, you get a feeling in your body, and that often pushes you to react. And so when I ask you to notice where it feels in your body, what somebody else might feel in their body, this is a way to start bridging some gaps, as well as become more familiar with understanding that your body informs how you respond to somebody else in ways that you're not always aware of. And we'll talk a little more about this in a bit. So I'm going to shift a little bit. So that was learning, orientation, how we got here to wherever we are in our lives. And oh, by the way, our identities and our orientations can change at any point in time. They're not static, because as we learn, as we have experiences, as we grow our empathy, sometimes we discover that there are resonances in ourselves. So staying aware of what's happening in your body as you talk to people who are different, as you engage in interactions and experiences that are out of your typical experiences, and being connected to that feeling in your body might allow you to explore aspects of yourself that you weren't even aware of. And I really appreciate that Jeff identified that all of this comes from God, right? That we were created with this capacity. And it is how we interact with it and how we manage it that allows us to either be someone who is open, empathetic, and willing to engage with other people who are different and engage across some of the gaps between us. We have the skills. We've been endowed with all of that, with our physical senses and our brains, our hearts. So being aware of that every time I ask this question, every time you move forward during this course, during this class series, being aware of what your body feels like, where it feels tight or uncomfortable or excited or anything else, is super important as you become someone who can actually have comfortable conversations with others. So now I want to ask, again, staying in your body as I ask this question and you answer it for yourself, and because we're doing this all as personal reflection, what aspects of sex or sexuality are you curious about? Notice that I frame it as curiosity, so we want to talk about, what are the things I want to know more about? Or what are the things that I hear about that I've never really been able to explore, either with myself or with somebody else, or even to understand how someone else lives those experiences, explores those experiences? What are those things? What are you most curious about? As you feel that curiosity, where do you feel it in your body? And what does it feel like? Take a moment and just kind of go inward to see that. To see that and feel it. It's really about feeling it. It's not a visual. You can visualize it though. Curiosity for me feels like this space in my heart and mind that is empty and open, but in a way that invites me to fill it, invites me to ask questions and inquire add to my knowledge base. So that's how I see it and feel it. You may be different. So the next question is, do you feel any shame about being curious about any of these things? Sometimes when we're very honest with ourselves about sex in particular, and the things we're curious about, there can be shame that accompanies that curiosity, especially if what you're curious about is something that you were brought up to believe, or your partner or family or culture or church tells you maybe isn't acceptable. So if you feel shame about any aspect of the curiosity you carry, where do you feel that? What does it feel like in your body? So I bring up shame because it's incredibly important when we talk about sex and sexuality. Shame is a cultural tool. It is used by parents, school, partners, community, culture, whenever there's a community norm or a rule or a standard that one is expected to meet, but you don't meet it. Shame is the tool that is often used. Well, sometimes, because of where we learned about sex or what we did or didn't learn about sex, which is why I started with that question, we generate our own shame. And I know a lot of people talk to me about the fact that because they didn't learn about some aspect of sex or sexuality as they were growing up, and it was never discussed. So it was just not ever discussed, not even that it was a negative, but that they never learned about it. And then they discover they're interested or curious about some aspect of sexual intimacy, sexual expression, sexual identity or orientation. They themselves, their own brains, do a fabulous job of shaming themselves. And for most of us, it isn't that we get shamed from the outside as adults, it's that we actually shame ourselves from the inside. And that controls our behavior and keeps us ignoring parts of ourselves or engaging in activities that we feel shameful about. So we do them in secret, or we do them in ways that are unhealthy because we're so curious about it and we're so interested in it, but we can't be curious or interested in about it because we're not allowed to be, or we think we're not allowed to be. So we engage in it furtively, in secret. And that's often where people get lost in the process. The process of discovering something that interests them, but because they have to hide it, because of the shame they feel, or they're worried they will be shamed, they engage in it in the ways that are secretive, out of view, and often can get out of control because they have no balance. And so Charlie and I were talking when we discussed this series, and Charlie was talking about how to frame the conversation about things like pornography use. And is there such a thing as acceptable, unacceptable? Is there such a thing as pornography addiction? Is there such a thing as, and the way I talk about it is any of our behaviors, including using pornography for sexual stimulation or gratification, including all kinds of other activities, any behavior of ours as a human can get out of control when we don't have the skills to moderate it, when we don't understand how to keep it within the boundaries of a healthy life. And so understanding the role of shame and how shame often drives people into unhealthy behaviors and unhealthy patterns is important when you start thinking about being more open about sex and sexuality, because you may encounter somebody who's engaging in a behavior that has gotten out of control. And how you approach that, how you understand it, how you understand how it works or doesn't work for the person, how it serves them in some way that may or may not be healthy is important. So being open to that, understanding that there may be a lot of shame that they grew up with, that they're carrying, that there may be shame that you feel about what's going on. Again, learning how to understand all of this and carry it is the first step to becoming open to understanding the variations in how people live with their sexuality, with their sexual identity, with their orientation, and how they can do so in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. Because there are many healthy ways and there are many unhealthy ways. There are some unhealthy ways. So now I want you to identify for yourself, what are the things about sex or sexuality, practices, identities, behaviors that make you incredibly uncomfortable? And where do you feel it in your body, and what does it feel like? So I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes to really just say, these are the things that are unacceptable to me, uncomfortable to me, not okay. As you write these, and then as you read them over, really notice where in your body you feel the discomfort. It could be distaste, it could be disgust, it could be shame, it could be judgment. We all feel those things. I'm not judging anyone for feeling them. We all have boundaries about what feels okay for us and what doesn't. So no judgment here. This is about understanding it. This is about saying, and when I encounter this situation, I feel like this. And then the next question I have for you is, when you feel that way, what do you do? Do you say something? Do you walk away? Do you express your discomfort openly and verbally, or with your face, or both? This is important because once you know the aspects of sex and sexuality that really aren't okay with you for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. It can be that you're uncomfortable. It can be that you were taught that they were wrong. It can be that you struggle with it yourself and you feel shame and judgment. And so therefore you actually feel the same towards somebody else. And that does happen. Knowing that, knowing how it feels, and knowing that you're likely to respond in maybe not an open and supportive way, allows you to say, I'm not the right person to talk to this person about this. And I do a lot of work with healthcare providers, and I teach a lot to all kinds of healthcare providers. And I encourage them to say to themselves, I'm not comfortable with this situation, with this aspect of this person, with their behavior, with their identity, whatever. And to say to themselves, so who do I know that I can ask to take over for me? Because we don't have to do everything. We don't have to be everything to everybody. The point of this series and the point of this talk is to learn how to be more comfortable and open when you can, but it's also to identify the areas where you really can't be comfortable and it's not something you want to work on right now. And that's okay. We do not have to do it all. We just have to know when it's time to step back. That said, how do we engage with people who are really different from us, who have different sexual orientations, identities, gender identities, who have different practices? A lot of times people who have very vastly different practices from your own won't share them openly because of fear of judgment. So understand that you shouldn't assume anything about the people that you encounter, except that they are humans with desires and passions, and that we all seek pleasure in different ways. And I'm going to stop and say, this is the moment when it's really important for you and for me and for everybody else to say, so what is it that I think makes up healthy sexuality? Now, my definition and yours may be very different. I send along a brochure where we define healthy sexuality and some aspects. So you can read about sort of a more in-depth perspective on that. But my definition of healthy sexuality is pretty broad, and it is that it is defined from within. So remembering back to my story that I learned how to define healthy sexuality and pleasure from myself first, that it is consensual. That is, that I am not asking anyone else to do something that makes them uncomfortable or to which they do not consent. That it is involving another adult. That it does not result in harm, psychological or physical. That's pretty broad. Everything else can be considered healthy and normal sexuality, as long as it is safe, as long as it is consensual, as long as it does not result in harm to the psyche or the body. So if I hold that as my definition of healthy sexuality, how do I stay open to hearing people's stories, to hearing their desires, to hearing their experiences? When I grow up in a culture, like all of us do, that has defined sex and sexuality and what's acceptable in very different ways depending on who you are and where you grew up. And so the way you do that is you say, so where in my body do I feel the things that stop me, that shut me down from being able to hear somebody's story or be open to their experiences? So I identify it, I take a breath. And then I take a step back and a moment, so I don't respond right away if I feel judgment rising or shame rising. And I ask myself, but we're all human. So where do our experiences as humans overlap? What are the things that I can ask myself that we must share? Is it that we all want love? Is it that we all want connection with someone else? Is it that we all want pleasure? Is it that we all want a feeling of community and acceptance? And if it's those things, how do I have a conversation? How do I ask open-ended questions? How do I be curious in ways that allow me to look for those things? What does love look like for you? What does an intimate connection consist of for you? What are the experiences you've had growing up as somebody who doesn't fit maybe with our society's expectations? Tell me your stories. Tell me your fears. If we ask those kinds of questions, the open-ended questions that encourage people to share their experiences and stories, and we pay attention to how it feels when we receive them and not react from the parts of us that go, ugh, or, I was taught that was wrong, but instead hold ourselves open to the possibility that we still have things in common with this person who may feel very different from us. That's how we have good dialogue. That's how we reach across the gaps and the gulfs. And that's true for everything, not just sex and sexuality. But because you've got this next series coming up, I want you to continually check in with yourself, check in with how it feels, check in with what feels opening and curious to you, engages your curiosity, check in to see what shuts you down. Don't react from shutting down, react from a place of understanding it and trying to open a little space. And if you can do that to any extent, understand that that's going to serve you beautifully as you engage with people, as you try to understand their lives and their experiences. You don't have to be them. You don't have to even like them. But if you can open your heart and your understanding to feel empathy for them, you'll create a situation where you can have great dialogue and help them feel like they can share their stories and experiences.
Ellen, if I could just jump in for a minute, it's Charlie here. Thank you for your words. I needed to scoot down the hall to get ready for our second worship service, but just a quick reminder for people, the series is called Let's Talk About Sex. So it's, Ellen's inviting us to talk and we can't do that in person, obviously. I encourage you, I urge you to find ways to talk. And if you need to talk to people, staff, other members of the church, please do. A lot of good, caring people out there. And at 12 noon, there's another Zoom link. It was in your email to join a sermon talkback for sort of open conversation at that time. And the two documents that Ellen mentioned were in your Friday Connections email and in the email that you received this morning. So sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to highlight all that stuff. Thank you, Ellen.
That's all right, Charlie. I was just done. I was going to ask for a question next. So that was perfect timing. Thank you. All right. So anybody have questions? Curiosities?
I'm keeping an eye on people. And so I'm able to see kind of who's up. And if you can raise your hand on the Zoom, then that'll help. If not, just give me a heads up visually. I'm not seeing anybody specifically right now, but okay. I have one just, obviously this is something that you do. This is something you do often, something you do regularly, these conversations. And there are probably a lot of people on this call who do not. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, outside of the resources Charlie mentioned, what are some resources in our immediate vicinity? Or obviously, I'm thinking about you being located in Madison, but also there must be wealth of resources found online, but it's kind of tough to sift through it when we're not trained in recognizing what are some of the healthier or less healthy areas. So I'm wondering, do you have resources that in Madison or abroad?
So I think unfortunately, it's way too big a question. You're right. There's tons and tons of stuff. So it depends on what your question is and what you want to explore. You've got some great speakers lined up for portions of of this series. And so they are your resources. I am always a resource for anybody who wants to explore any of the topics that you're talking about here, as well as explore the topics around personal curiosities and shame and how to overcome those, how to find ways to stop feeling judgment, stop feeling shame. I have lots of resources in my store. I think, again, you're always best served by, if you're going to look on the internet, you're best served by asking very specific questions and looking for places that don't start with judgment, right? This is where I like people to understand that there are so many different ways to approach a topic. And what you want to find is places that allow you to learn rather than be told what to think. And so I really encourage you, as you explore, to always ask the question, am I being told what to think, or am I being asked to think and explore? But Jeff, I'm afraid that there are so many resources and there are so few. And it really varies. As you go through your series, I think you'll get a lot more specific resources. And again, my shop has tons of them, lots of books, as well as the availability of a conversation with me at any point in time. You can always stop in. We do have store hours, and we do allow people to ask questions. The other thing I will do is I will make sure that Melissa and Nancy know that they can share my email address with the congregation, so that if people have specific questions or things they want to explore or wonder about, I'm available by email and I answer all my emails.
Thank you very much. And maybe we can include that in the connections link that we send next week, just as a follow-up. And quite frankly, having a framework and a structure of finding resources, the ability to ask ourselves the question, gives us, I think, some extra latitude to know that we're doing this in at least a somewhat responsible way. So we're not just Googling, is sex good?
Well, you could. That would be a fascinating Google. I don't know what you'd learn. I'll have to try that.
Well, let me know how your research turns out. We do have a couple minutes left. And so I am really open to any other questions or comments. In the chat, we are seeing some expressions of gratitude, and that is absolutely how I'm feeling as well. And I'm sure many other people on this call, most all, you don't need to explicitly say it in the chat, but it is nice to see. And in the meantime, if there's anybody else who has something they are curious about, interested in, or a comment they'd like to share, I am looking around.
I recognize that it's really hard to do. Nobody wants to encounter the possibility of shame or judgment, right? So sometimes I have done these kinds of talks with anonymous chat and anonymous question opportunities. So that's something else. But I do want to encourage people, you are welcome to email me directly, or you're welcome to email Charlie or Jeff and ask them to pass things on anonymously, because I'm happy to answer questions that they can then bring back to all of you. And it doesn't, I don't want anybody to be feeling shame or discomfort. Super important, right? What did I say? When we feel shame or discomfort, we react sometimes in ways we don't even mean to, with judgment, with shaming, trying to shut other people down. So finding whatever way it is that works best for you to ask your questions and to explore safely so that you can push against some of those feelings of discomfort, it's a great choice.
Yeah. Thank you. I am actually seeing we do have a hand up, but I do want to just really quickly, Judy, you are good to go in a second. I really want to emphasize that my job, my goal, my hope, my orientation for anyone is to react first in love. I mean, that's kind of what our faith compels us to do. And so I want to emphasize, if there is a question, if there's something happening or something you're curious about, and if you want me to send it anonymously, very glad to do so. And if you want to dialogue about it, I'm here, and my goal is to provide a space in which we can explore together, and in which we can consider how our faith, how our createdness, how our world functions, and while being faithful to each other and God. So Judy, I'm gonna turn it over to you now. I said you can go, but then, I kept talking. So you'll need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Ellen, for coming today. And I'm so impressed with our church. Thank you.
Yes.
Was really taken. I've been trying to find middle ground in the politics realm, and trying to find the overlap. And what you said here, and you mentioned, it's not just about sex, it's about everything. Boy, I just, it really resonated with me. Finding that overlap where we can have dialogue. I have found so much in politics and in other areas too, that we get so rigid and so triggered, and how we can calm down those triggers enough that we can hear, calming down with curiosity. So I just was kind of excited to see this same thing applies to every different part of our life.
Truly, truly, thank you. And again, I think what Jeff said about approaching everything with an open heart and with love first, really hard to do. I mean, I struggle with people who are very, very opposed to what I support and vice versa. But we all have places that we share. We all have places that we can say, oh, well, we all want certain things in life. What are those things? How do we meet on that ground? And then how do we understand that what people are saying or doing is their own version of an expression of what needs they're trying to meet? And really be open to that. Super hard, takes a lot of work. It's exhausting. And these days it's even more exhausting because everything is exhausting. But yes, the same approach works for all of the areas in which we have potential differences.
And thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to remove the spotlight real quick, so I guess you'll see my face because I'm talking here. And I've got a live stream to go to right now. Otherwise, I would stay here forever and have this conversation as an ongoing thing, because this is really wonderful. John, I do see your question. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to it, but there may be an answer floating out there that could be communicated to you somehow. But I just want to.
I actually think, John, you should ask that question. You've got a section on orientation coming up. And so save that question and make sure that gets sent then. I think it's an interesting question. I will say there is some science and some, and not a lot, but I would wait. And when the folks from outreach come, I think that's a great opportunity to ask that question.
Well, very good. Thank you. So copy and paste that, email that to yourself, and I'll be there. So I'll close this in prayer. Holy and wonderful God, we know that your orientation towards us is love. That before we do anything, before we open our eyes, before we ever were, you loved us and continue to love us. We ask that you open us to that kind of love, that we may be vessels and channels of that love to one another, that we may encounter each other with open hearts and open minds, that we may learn to value the breadth and myriad experiences and orientations and thoughts and lives that you put in our hearts and in this world. Keep us open, keep us curious. Banish shame from us. You are a God of mercy and forgiveness and love and grace, and those things that we feel shame about, we know that you care and hold us in. So open us to express ourselves honestly, to listen honestly, and to love always. Amen. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
being here, and thank you everybody else for being here too. After thanks for pivoting. I know this wasn't how we were going to do it, but we did it this way, and it was wonderful. And I will see all of you either on the computer or in passing or in person, or I'll see y'all soon. All right. Thank you all. I'm going to end the meeting now, and worship's started already. So, all right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.